there is a letter. Written by Hernando del Pulgar, Isabel's own royal chronicler, the man she trusted to record her reign for posterity, about the woman he served. And in it, buried between the official praise and the diplomatic language, there is a sentence that stops you cold. He wrote, "The Queen Our Lady from childhood her father died on her, and we can also say her mother, which for children is no small misfortune. Her father died when she was 3. Her mother did not die. But she stopped being present in any way that a child could recognize as a mother. She retreated into a room in a palace in a small Castilian town and over the years came out less and less. The attacks of madness, what the chroniclers called locura, what modern medicine would probably diagnose as severe postpartum depression that was never treated and never resolved, became the central fact of Isabel's childhood. Not the royal blood. Not the inheritance. Not the politics that would eventually make her the most powerful woman in Europe. The central fact was a closed door. And a girl on the other side of it, learning to take care of herself. Because nobody else was going to. She was born a princess nobody wanted. Her father died when she was 3. Her mother lost her mind. Her half-brother the king forgot she existed, until he remembered she was useful. What happened between the girl in Arevalo and the woman who invented Spain is the story nobody tells properly. Subscribe, like the video, and let's start at the very beginning. April 22, 1451. Isabel was born in Madrigal de las Altas Torres, in the palace that today houses the monastery of Nuestra Señora de Gracia. Her father was Juan II of Castile, a king who had reigned for 48 years and who had managed, across nearly 5 decades on the throne, to be consistently outmaneuvered by his own nobles. A gentle man. A cultured man. A man who loved poetry and music and the refined pleasures of court life, and who had spent his reign watching the aristocracy of Castile accumulate power at the crown's expense while he wrote verses and commissioned illuminated manuscripts. He was not a great king. He was not even an adequate king by the standards of what Castile needed. But he was Isabel's father, and she would spend the first 3 years of her life in his court before he died, and the world she had been born into changed completely. When Juan II died in 1454, Isabel's mother gathered her 2 small children, Isabel, 3 years old, and Alfonso, 1, and withdrew to the town of Arevalo. It was supposed to be temporary. It lasted 11 years. Arevalo. A small Castilian town on the high plateau of central Spain. The Meseta, that vast flat landscape of ochre earth and enormous skies that defines the heart of Castile. The palace they lived in was not modest in the way that comfortable people use the word modest. It was modest in the way that a building becomes when the money that was supposed to maintain it has stopped arriving. The testamentary provisions that Juan II had left for his wife and children were never carried out. His son Enrique IV, the half-brother who inherited the throne, ignored all of it. Not maliciously at first. Simply through the particular negligence of a weak man surrounded by stronger ones who had more interesting things for him to think about. So the money didn't come. The provisions weren't honored. And in a small palace in Arevalo, a woman who had been Queen of Castile sat in a room that she was increasingly reluctant to leave, and her 2 children learned what the world was like when the people who are supposed to protect you have stopped being able to. What happened to Isabel de Portugal, the queen, the mother, the woman whose name her daughter carried, is one of the most documented and most misunderstood stories in Castilian history. The chroniclers called it madness. In her era it was understood as mental derangement, and although that word still follows her in popular culture, the symptoms she presented correspond in modern medicine to severe postpartum depression. Untreated, undiagnosed, occurring in the 15th century in a woman who had lost her husband, been deprived of her promised income, been confined to a provincial palace with 2 small children, and had no access to any support beyond the small court that formed around her in reduced circumstances. It progressed. The attacks came more frequently. The periods of clarity became shorter. The chronicler Andrés Bernaldez, who knew Isabel personally in her adult years, wrote about those Arevalo years with a bleakness that was unusual for official court chronicles. Many sad years, many years linked together by sorrows and anxieties, the child Isabel praying, reading, attending her mother with great care as the madness began to show its rigors. This image, the girl who prays and reads and attends her mother, is the image of Isabel's childhood that the sources give us most consistently. Isabel and her younger brother Alfonso lived in Arevalo as witnesses to their mother's attacks. They watched. They waited. They learned. What does it do to a child, to a girl of 7, 8, 10 years old, to watch someone she loves lose themselves gradually to something that cannot be explained or stopped? What does it teach her about reliability, about the institutions that are supposed to protect people and don't, about the gap between what the world promises and what it delivers. We can't know what Isabel thought in those years. The sources don't record the private thoughts of children, and Isabel was not yet a person whom anyone thought worth recording. But we can know what she learned, because she spent the rest of her life demonstrating it. She learned that you cannot depend on others to honor their obligations. You must enforce them. She learned that weakness, her father's weakness, her mother's illness, the weakness of the institutions that were supposed to fund and protect them, has consequences that fall on the people who cannot escape them. She learned to control her face. The chronicler Alonso Flores, describing Isabel as an adolescent, wrote that she did not lack attractiveness but already stood out for her seriousness, that she was rarely and seldom seen to laugh as was customary at that age. She was not a melancholy child. She was a child who had decided, at an age when most children are still learning the rules of the game, that showing what she felt was a luxury she could not afford. Two people kept Isabel from growing up entirely alone in Arevalo, and both of them mattered more than the chronicles usually acknowledge. The first was Gonzalo Chacon, a man who had served in the orbit of Alvaro de Luna, the most powerful nobleman in Castile under Juan II, the man who had essentially governed the kingdom for decades before being executed on the king's orders in one of Juan II's few decisive acts. Chacon had survived his patron's fall. He had landed in Arevalo in the service of the queen and her children, and he had decided that the girl he was tutoring was worth taking seriously. He taught her what he knew: history, letters, the management of a household, the basic political geography of a kingdom that was going to be hers to navigate whether she wanted it or not. He was, in the absence of any father figure, the closest thing to one that the palace in Arevalo provided. The relationship between Chacon and Isabel was one of the few constants of her childhood. The man who showed up, who stayed, who treated her education as something that mattered even when nobody with real power was watching. And then there was Beatriz de Bobadilla, daughter of the guardian of the castle of Arevalo, not a great noble, not a princess, not a person of political consequence. Just a girl who grew up in the same town and who, by some combination of personality and proximity and the particular chemistry of childhood friendship, became the one person in Isabel's life who was simply a friend. Not a tutor. Not a political ally. Not a marriage prospect or a diplomatic asset. A friend. Beatriz de Bobadilla would remain at Isabel's side for the rest of her life, through the wars, the court intrigues, the pregnancies, the campaigns, the decisions that changed the world. When almost everything else in Isabel's life was political, Beatriz was personal. In the palace in Arevalo, surrounded by her mother's illness and her brother's childhood and the chronic shortage of money and the absence of everything that her father's will had promised, these two relationships, the paternal Chacon and the friendship with Beatriz, were what Isabel had. It was enough. Barely. But it was enough. In 1461, when Isabel was 10 years old, the summons arrived from her half-brother's court. She did not want to go. The chroniclers record that she obeyed reluctantly and always missed the days in Arevalo. This is striking, that the girl who had grown up in poverty and isolation, watching her mother deteriorate, missing the father she never really knew, would miss the place where all that happened. But Arevalo was hers. The court of Enrique IV was something else entirely. Enrique IV of Castile is one of the more difficult figures in Castilian history to assess fairly, because almost everything written about him was written by people with reasons to discredit him. His sexual dysfunction, the impotence that gave him his historical nickname, was the subject of detailed official testimony in a formal inquiry. His court was, by the consistent account of multiple chroniclers, a place of faction and counterfaction, of nobles who had understood that the king could be managed and had organized their entire political lives around managing him. Isabel watched all of it. She observed the conspiracies of ambitious nobles, characters of dubious morality without scruples, betrayals committed in broad daylight and then denied with complete composure. She was 10 years old. She had just arrived from a quiet, impoverished, isolated childhood in a provincial palace. And what she found in her half-brother's court was the entire machinery of Castilian political dysfunction on display, every weakness of the crown, every manipulation of the nobles, every gap between the way power was supposed to work and the way it actually worked. She was a quick study. Enrique had brought her to court because she was useful, a potential marriage piece, a political asset that could be deployed when the right opportunity arose. He wasn't thinking about her as a person. He wasn't thinking about what the girl from Arevalo was learning by watching his court. He was thinking about the useful thing that her marriage to an attractive and serious half-sister could achieve for his politics. He was also, and this is the detail that changes everything, thinking about controlling her. Because there were already people in Castile who were looking at Enrique's court and his increasingly contested claim to the succession, looking at the question of who would rule Castile after him, and seeing a girl from Arevalo with a very credible claim. Enrique wanted her where he could see her. What he didn't understand, what nobody in that court understood yet, was that she was already at 10 years old, watching them all with the same careful attention. Counting the weaknesses, filing the lessons, waiting. The court taught Isabel two things very quickly. The first was that being a princess was not protection. It was exposure. Enrique IV arranged for his half-sister to be married to Pedro Giron, master of the Order of Calatrava, one of the most powerful military commanders in Castile, a man in his 50s whose personal behavior was the subject of scandalized comment even in a court not known for its delicacy. Isabel was 12. Giron was marching toward her with his troops. She prayed. Specifically and urgently, the sources record that she prayed with the intensity of someone who has no other recourse and knows it. She prayed for God to prevent the marriage by any means necessary. Pedro Giron died on the road. Of a sudden illness, 3 days from his destination. Isabel believed for the rest of her life that her prayer had been answered. The historians note that Giron was old and unhealthy and that the road was hard. The outcome is not in dispute. The marriage did not happen. The lesson was not lost on her. The world was full of men who would treat her as a political object. Prayer might work, but prayer required a backup. The backup was her brother Alfonso. 2 years younger, the boy who had grown up beside her in Arevalo, who had watched the same closed door, who understood without being told what their childhood had been. Alfonso became, in the years at Enrique's court, the other half of whatever plan Isabel was beginning to formulate. Because in 1465, something extraordinary happened. A group of Castilian nobles carried out a ceremony that had never been done before and has never been done since. They erected a platform in a field outside Avila. They placed on it a life-size effigy of Enrique IV in royal robes, with crown and scepter. They read out a list of charges against the king. Then one by one they stripped the effigy of its crown, its scepter and its sword. Then they threw the effigy off the platform. Then they turned to a 12-year-old boy standing beside them, Alfonso, Isabel's brother, and proclaimed him King of Castile. The farce of Avila. The most theatrical act of political defiance in the history of the Castilian crown, and the moment that made Isabel understand that the throne was not merely a theoretical possibility for her family. It was a prize, and there was a war being fought for it. 3 years later, Alfonso was dead, of plague, of poison, of a sudden illness whose cause the sources debate and never resolve. And the prize fell to her. She was 17 years old. She had spent her childhood in poverty, watching her mother disappear, counting other people's weaknesses, learning to keep her face still. She had survived a forced marriage through what she believed was divine intervention. She had watched her brother be made a king and then die. Now Enrique IV, the half-brother who had brought her to court as a political asset, who had tried to control her, who had never understood what he was actually dealing with, was looking at her from across the room. And she was looking back.